I'm Charles Davis. I'm the Dean of the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication, and it is my great honor to introduce you to a couple of my colleagues and friends who are going to be your entertainment for this evening. I will begin, ladies first, with Moni Basu. Moni directs our narrative nonfiction track in our low residency MFA program. That's a lot of words. She does a fantastic job. Moni is a veteran journalist. She was previously the Michael Linda Connolly Lecturer in Narrative Nonfiction at some place called the University of Florida until we hired her away. Before teaching, she was a reporter and an editor at CNN, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and several other newspapers. She still writes as a freelancer, and her recent work has been published in the Bitter Southerner and Flamingo magazine. She is joined by our friend and colleague in the low residency MFA program, John T. Edge. John's the author of House of Smoke. That's why y'all are here, I think, for the most part. But he also writes and hosts the National Emmy Award-winning television show, TrueSouth, on the SEC Network, ESPN, Disney, and Hulu. If you haven't seen it, get yourself there. It's some fine television. I think it's some of the best writing on the television medium these days, bar none. His 2017 book, The Potlikker Papers, A Food History of the Modern South, was named one of the best books of the year by NPR and Publishers Weekly. Ed serves as the University of Mississippi as a teacher, writer in residence, and director of the Mississippi Lab. And he serves the University of Georgia, as I mentioned, as a mentor in our low residency MFA program in narrative nonfiction, so we claim him too, powerfully. He lives in Oxford, Mississippi, along with his wife, the artist Blair Hobbs, and is just a dear friend and has been for quite a while. So we're delighted you're here, John T. Moni, take it away. It should be.
Now it's on.
Can you all hear me? Great. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I've had the pleasure of knowing John T. for, more than 10 years since we launched this MFA program back in 2015. And I now have the privilege of calling him a dear friend and someone who has helped me, like he has so many others, see the South in a whole different way. So thank you for that. I have some serious questions to ask John T., but since we're in Athens, I thought we would begin tonight by talking a little bit about John T.'s experience here at the University of Georgia. When I first met him, I was told that he had attended school here, and I just assumed he was a star alum of the Grady College. And later I found out actually that the movie Animal House was his guide through his college years here at UGA. So John T., welcome back to Athens.
Thank you.
Your book is called The House of Smoke, and it's all about finding home. Do you feel that you're back home in Athens?
I do, Moni, and thank you for the kind words and the kind welcome, and thank you, Charles, and thank you to everyone here. It's a joy to return here. Because I teach in this program now, I get to return here often, and I get to see people like my great friend Peggy Gallus, who's about 5 rows back there, who I think every good thing that's happened in my life over the last 10 years, Peggy has somehow engineered it. And my great friend Judy Long, who is sitting just to her left. Judy published my first book back when she was running Hill Street Press here. So in a bunch of different ways, yes, this is a homecoming for me. When I get a letter from the fundraising office here at the University of Georgia, they don't write Dear Graduate, they write Dear Matriculate. That's pretty cold, I think. I'm still giving them some money, but maybe a little bit more if I wasn't just a matriculate. But that's what I was. I flunked out of this place. And one of my proudest professional accomplishments is to have built a career and done work that landed me back here to teach. It's a joy. And I've learned so much in this program. Teaching, my writing has gotten immeasurably better over the last decade of teaching here at the University of Georgia. I'm so thankful to the people in this room, especially to Moni Mala, to my colleague who are here with whom I teach, including Pat Thomas, who's sitting in the front row. I'd like to read a little Athens piece as a way to memorialize my time here and celebrate someone who's in the room. So this is about my fraternity life. I was a Sigma Nu here at the University of Georgia. And I drank a lot and I danced a lot. But other people had other ideas. So this is a short piece. It's a page and a half. This isn't going to be a reading intensive conversation. We're actually going to have a conversation. But I want y'all to hear this. My fraternity brothers and I teased a pledge we call man-child. Lanky and muscled and seemingly country, John Cleveland arrived from Jacksonville, Florida, in a Japanese pickup, jacked high on mutters. Manchild painted a moonshine still on the glove box, as if to say, "These are my people." He was a work in progress. We all were. When Manchild was a freshman and I was a sophomore, I adopted him as a running buddy. Late that fall, we traveled to his hometown for the Georgia-Florida football game. Other kids cruised Fernandina Beach, tall boys in hand, or booked tables at Benny's Red Barn up on St. Simon Island to eat ribeyes and drink those ice cream and alcohol bombs they call raccoons. Manchild planned a drive into the piney woods to an oversized barn lit by floodlights. From a perch high in the wooden bleachers, we watched roosters and people lunge at one another. Money changed hands and fistfights exploded. Blood clotted the sawdust floor and cocks strutted. I would like to remember that what I saw that night disgusted me, but those cockfights were spectacles. On a search for all things outrageous, in an attempt to channel my mother's maximalism, we'll talk about my mother later, spectacles were my currency of choice. By his junior year, Manchild wore tight shorts and tube socks and raced his 16 speed around Athens. In that phase, we brothers called him Sport Child. In phase 3, he invited us to his room at the fraternity house to drink Tanqueray. I began calling him Sophistichild. When John took to painting abstracts, inspired in part by Richard Olson, a veteran of the Vietnam War, who taught him to think about color in new ways, we called him Art Child. After that persona took, a career as a landscape painter followed. Battle sites from the Civil War came first, then landscapes from World War I. By the time we caught back up with each other in the late 2010s, he was painting the wild places of Georgia near his home in the little town of Farmington down the road from Athens. In college, we teased Manchild because his search was overt. Like generations of college kids before and after, we poked at what we couldn't understand. We were lost and trying hard to cover that up. Manchild lived the search, committing himself again and again to the change he wanted to make. In Manchild, we saw our weaknesses and aspirations amplified. We envied him because we didn't yet know how to trap that drive in ourselves.
No, I always love listening to John T., but I especially like listening to you read your own writing. Thank you for reading that. I wanted to ask you something. Let's start with something deeply personal.
Okay.
You have authored a lot of books about the South. You have been studying the South for a long time now. What made you turn the lens on yourself? Why did you decide to write this memoir, and why now?
So in 2018, our son, Jess, was about to go off to college. And I wrote this instruction manual for him to go off to college. It included like how to grill a steak, a ribeye specifically, how to mix a Negroni, how much to tip in a restaurant, Always take the cell phone call outside of the building in which you find yourself. And the instruction manual was great, and it was practical, but there were a lot of things I'd left out of the stories I'd told him. I hadn't written an instruction manual for how to be a member of our family. I hadn't told him stories about my mother. I'd kind of written my mother out of the story of our family. So as Jess began to get ready to go to college, I began to talk to him about my mother and the way we found a path back to her. She had died just 11 days before Jess was born. The way we found a path back was through a recipe that had always been in our home in Oxford, always been right next to the stove. A recipe for catfish stew. It was my mother's catfish stew, her father's before that. The recipe for that catfish stew, it's the only recipe in this book. It's the stew is now cooked by my wife. But in that moment, as I began to retrieve my mother's story and tell it to our son, I wrote a piece for the Oxford American titled My Mother's Catfish Stew. In writing that piece, I didn't know the power of my own story until I wrote that piece. I didn't know the power of my own story until people walked up to me and said, I read about your mother, and, her drug was sangria, and I now know you grew up in Georgia. I grew up in Texas, and my mother's drug of choice was barbiturates, but I see some of my own story in yours. And in those exchanges, I began to understand that memoir, which I had thought of as an act of selfishness, really, I realized that writing memoir, if you bore down on the truth about yourself and open yourself up, can be an act of generosity for your readers. It can offer them a path forward. And in that moment, I realized I had work to do, and I began thinking about this book. I'll try to make next answer shorter.
Well, you grew up not too far from here in a town called Clinton, in a home that you say was filled with mythology, violence, alcoholism.
Yeah.
I wonder if I could please get you to read the opening to your book. It's a short piece, and then we can talk a little bit more about your mother.
Yeah. Running. I burst out the screen door, bare feet on gravel. 20 feet ahead, my mother runs toward the dark woods, her red house dress trailing like a cape. She couldn't take another minute inside our house. She couldn't take another minute inside her head. The light from our porch doesn't reach where she's going. At first, I can see the pistol in her hand. But as my mother crosses into the clearing, the red of her dress fades and everything turns black. The crack of that pistol splits open the night. I stumble, catch myself, and plunge forward, past the sand pile where, just a few years before, I plowed toy dump trucks along pretend roads lined with toy skyscrapers. I find her in the rock garden, among the pink azaleas, beneath the cedar arbor. Mama sits on a bench beside the old jail kitchen that she never quite turned into an antique shop. She cries into her dress. Tears fall down her face. The pistol lies on the ground. Smoke trails from her cigarette. Was that a warning shot? Did my mother push the door open and run toward the woods to fire her pistol into the blue-black sky? Or did she plan to shoot herself? Did she aim above her earrings, change her mind, and crumple to that bench? 5 decades later, I stand at the edge of that memory and peer back in, like I'm watching a scratched print of a black and white film about my childhood. She wanted to make a break. She wanted to make a change. And there was no better way to mark before and after than a run toward the woods and a shot in the night. I ran for a long time too, away from that house, away from my family, away from what my past taught, away from what the South demanded. until finally I turned to face the dark woods.
Whew, that's powerful. You didn't attend your mother's funeral, but more recently, in recent years, you went back to visit her grave, and in fact, you did an episode for your TV show about that, in which I believe you broke down and sobbed. Could you tell us a little bit about why you went back, and why you decided to go back when you did, and what that experience was like?
So I mentioned, our son's going off to college in 2018. I wrote that Oxford American piece. I think that was 2019. In 2020, we're in the third season of TrueSouth, and some of this is kind of practical. That we were, this is the middle of COVID. We had a whole run of TV shows planned that we were going to film, and then comes COVID and everything shut down. In this moment, we thought the SEC Network might fail. We thought college sports might be over. None of us knew, but we were determined to make our show. We wanted to kind of beat the odds and get on the road. So we rented a rock and roll tour bus because they weren't going out. And we piled our crew on there, and we tested to get on the bus, and we tested each afternoon after our work. When we began to compile the list of places we would film, we talked about doing a show in Orangeburg where my mother grew up, but no one in Orangeburg would put up with us. They were all, it was a moment of mistrust. No one would let us into homes. No one would allow us into restaurants. So we said, okay, we'll take this, my mother's catfish stew piece, and we'll turn it into a television show. Well, when you make a television show, you go on location. So we went back to where my mother was born, Bowman, South Carolina. That's the same place my mother is buried. As Moni mentioned, I had never been to her grave. But if you want to make good television, you step into that past. I stepped for the first time into the graveyard where my mother is buried. There were 4 cameras on me. As I did this, I remember as I stepped out of the car, Wright Thompson, our executive producer, told me he loved me, and I felt it. I had such trust in the people with whom I was making that show, and I walked toward my mother's grave. I dropped to my knee, and I asked her forgiveness, and I asked her to take me back, and I told her about the life I'd built since she passed. I told her about our son, who she never got to know. It was real. I was sobbing. It's so odd to make television and to do something real on television. We all think about it as a fabrication. My experience making TV, one of 2 things happen. It's really fake, or it's really real, and something about the cameras can open people up. I found this. We made an episode in Dublin, Georgia, with women in recovery at a hamburger joint in this place called Promise of Hope. And they told me the toughest things about their lives. By that point, we got 5 cameras on people, not just 4. In that moment, though, I cracked open. I really did take my mother back into my life. I really did kind of unburden the guilt I had for shutting her out. And then after, I'm really going long on answers. After that moment, our director, Tim Horgan, had booked a band my mother would have loved, called Ranky Tanky from the Low Country. They've now won, I see some nods in the audience, they've now won 2 Grammys. At that point, they'd just won 1. And there they were underneath the tree as I stepped away from my mother's grave to play just this gorgeous anthem to my mother. It was all real, and it's a big part of this book, because it's a step along the path for me to be honest about my past. And I think that's what this book is about in a lot of ways. It's about being honest about my past and embracing my past, not rejecting it, not pushing it away, to claim who I am, which is, I think, the work of a lifetime. To claim who I am in a very real way, and that meant for me going back to my mother's grave and making amends for my past.
So you had a lot going on when you wrote this book. You were grappling with your relationship with your mother, and you had also gone through a lot of, you had been at the center of controversy at the organization that you led for 20 years, the Southern Foodways Alliance. And the criticism of you there had been that you were a white man who was in control of an organization that was telling the stories of people from marginalized communities, black and brown communities. I think many people in the room here may have read the AJC story that came out earlier this month about your book that opened with that particular episode in your life. How did you deal with what happened to you back then? I know you write about it in the book, but how did you deal with it back then, and are you at peace with what happened?
Yeah. So you're asking how I dealt with it in that moment?
Yes.
In that moment, so I am challenged in my position by one of the founders of the organization that I directed, and by former employees, and by members of the organization, a wide range of people. I was at first bewildered and perplexed. I was frightened. I was hurt. It sideswiped me. I never saw this coming. I never saw it coming. So I started to report it out. I mean, it's what I did. I had dozens of conversations with people as I'm trying to figure out what's the extent of this when the challenge comes. What does it mean? What do I have to learn? So this was just after James Comey's moment in his famous use of contemporaneous evidence. So I was taking notes in that moment. I'd put on headphones and listen to people, and I would invite their critique. Tell me, I'm getting this public critique. Tell me what your take is on it now. I wanted to learn in that moment, and I wanted to react in a way that was not as an offended party, but as someone who wants to make continual improvements in their life, and I saw this as an opportunity to improve myself and learn. That isn't always the way I thought about it. In those moments, I was angry, deeply, deeply angry. But as time passed, I began to recognize that, the critique of me staying, one of the critiques was I'd been in my job too long. One of the critiques was I had too much power. The way I've come to think about it is it was, for me, that moment, it was an act of hubris, born perhaps of being in my job too long. I had won an award for My Undoing Begins This Way. I'd won an award for that piece in the Oxford American, A Mother's Catfish Stew. That won the M.F.K. Fisher Distinguished Writing Award that year from the James Beard Foundation. It was the best single piece of writing that year. And I was invited to take part in a webinar that the James Beard Foundation was staging. And they asked me to speak with other people to the topic of complicated families and what we can learn about complicated families by writing about food. And I said, oh, no. That's not what I do. I don't write about complicated families. That's an anomaly. I think the important thing to talk about in this moment is what good can writing about food do in this pitched, terrible, horrible moment in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. That's what I should be speaking about. And I put myself at the center of that instead of talking about the thing I just won an award for. And I think that's my undoing, or at least the catalytic force for that. So that's the thing I take away, in addition to a whole bunch of lessons that if you read the book, I think you'll find instructive, I hope, for this moment and the next moment and the next moment. But the thing I learned is to listen a bit more, which is an absurd thing to say for somebody who hosts a television show. But I do think that show, and I hope a lot of my work, is an act of listening.
Well, memoir writing is an act of vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
And I admire your courage in putting your story out there, honestly. That couldn't have been very easy for you to do. What was the hardest part for you, putting yourself at the center of the story?
It's, this is a 240-page memoir, I think, and it does the thing you're not supposed to do with a memoir. It covers basically my whole life. It goes from the time I'm about 8 until 60. I'm 62 now. So to try to write a story that would, I read the opening prologue of the book, to try to write a story that will pull you through that book. And a story that will offer you some path to realization yourself. Like, I wanted to write a story that was deeply personal. I also wanted to write a story that told of the evolution of the American South over my lifetime. So in this book, and that was the thing that was hardest to do, was to balance the two, Moni. In this book, I'm born into the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. I'm born into the teeth of the Civil Rights Movement. Jimmy Carter is elected president, and my parents and I are hauling the planes to go to the Jimmy Carter presidential headquarters. I begin college as Reagan displaces Carter in the White House. I live in Atlanta in the moment just before the Olympics arrive, and the whole world starts to focus on understanding the American South better, and so do I. I tried to write a book, and the hardest thing for me to accomplish was, how do I tell a story that becomes a universal story for Southerners and a story that's deeply and profoundly about my life?
I think we all grow up with stories that we inherit, stories that we grow up believing. I grew up in India believing all sorts of things about the United States that turned out not to be true.
You have that in common.
You write about how you grew up in a house that stood in the shadows of a memorial to a Confederate general, with the narrative of the lost cause being taught as gospel in your house. How did that shape you, and how did you come to terms with that story and decide which parts of it you were going to keep and which parts you were going to eject from your narrative?
Yeah, so the Alfred Iverson, who led the secession of Georgia from the Union, one of the two senators, U.S. senators from Georgia, lived in my house. And in 1829, his wife gave birth to their son, Alfred Iverson Jr., who, on the historical marker in front of our house, I learned as a boy that Alfred Iverson Jr. was a hero of the Civil War. There was kind of a time stamp of all the battles in which he served, on the historical markers with the dull green field with the gold letters. I memorized that as a boy. I would stand on a wash pot in front of our house because of that historical marker. People would drive up our driveway expecting to see like costumed interpreters at Williamsburg. But there I was on that wash pot telling of that valiant Confederate brigadier general. Writing this book, I did the thing that I talked about with my own downfall in 2020. I reported it out. So here at the University of Georgia and at Emory, I did big, deep archive dives to figure out, if I grew up in the time when the lost cause was gospel, and if during my graduate studies I began to understand that the lost cause gospel was far from the truth of the lived experience of people in the 1800s, and the way it led people of my generation to live led us toward ruin, then I needed to report that out. So I'll cut to the chase and say that, as I reported that out, I learned that Alfred Iverson Jr., who took his first breath in the house where I was born in 1829, and whose story my mother loved to tell because she thought it gave luster to ours. He led his troops to slaughter on the first day at Gettysburg. They approached, saw a rock wall in the distance, but did not see the bluecoats behind that wall. When those bluecoats rose to fire, the blood and brains of men in the first rank splattered men in the third rank. Blood ran so thick that a soldier described it later as running like a stream across the ground. This was the man I celebrated. That's a pretty overt example of retelling the stories that you tell as a boy, the stories you inherit. But I think it's metaphorical for the larger effort, which I think is, the work of writing really is revision. And my wife points out to me often that revision, think about the word, it's revision, to see again. And I think that's what is demanded of all of us who live in the South, is to see again, to think again, to be as honest and truthful about our past and the past of our place. And I think ultimately that's what I tried to do with this book.
Let me ask you a food question.
Okay.
So food has been your entry point to writing about the South for decades now. How did food function in this memoir? And do you think that food can help us heal the wounds that we bear here in the South, or does it sometimes, does it paper over deeper conflicts?
I'll forget the first question, but I'll answer the second one.
Okay.
Okay, and then we'll come back to the first one. I think that we expect too much out of food. Like, I genuinely believe that we can find common purpose, we can connect with others at a table well laid, and there's great promise in that. But let's not go too far. I think I may have gone too far in spreading the gospel of possibility at the table. Restaurants, we expect so much out of them. We expect them to be sustainable. We expect them to pay the people who work in the restaurants well. We expect the food to be, so much better than anything we can concoct in our own homes. That's expecting a lot out of a restaurant. We expect them to be arbiters of morality and, leading lights in politics. That's expecting a lot out of a restaurant. For myself, I think I remember the first question. For myself, we've talked some tonight about my mother, and there's I reveal a lot of tough things in this book about my mother. I also reveal her as a woman of great social intelligence and just flagrant in every way, beautifully so. But my father sometimes gets lost in that story, and to talk about food in my life, I oftentimes talk about my father. My father was a federal probation and parole officer. For a good long while, he had an office here in Athens. He worked on the Lemuel Penn case, which I'm sure most of y'all in this audience know. If you don't know, go read about it when you get home. He worked on that case. I was in the courtroom as a little boy when he was working on that case. My father traveled, middle and north Georgia as a probation officer. It means he was in contact with, sheriffs and parolees across the state. And that meant he ate a lot of meals on the road, and he loved barbecue. So when he would go burning up the state during the week, and on the weekend we'd go make a run ourselves. Sometimes it was just up the road to Old Clinton Barbecue, which is just a mile and a half from my house. Other times we'd go to Fresh Air in Flovilla near Jackson. I still deeply love Fresh Air. They were a part of our first episode of this season. We'd also go to this place called Hooks near Sandersville that was just remarkable. George Hooks ran it. And when you went into this concrete block building where he worked, he would hand you a pair of tongs and then point around to the side. And you'd walk around to the back, and there would be a pig splayed out on a grate in the back. And you would take those tongs and you'd pick whatever parts of meat you wanted. If you wanted ropey belly meat just dripping with skeins of grease, you could get that. You could get the crunchy shoulder meat. You could get a mix of the two.
Do you know how horrifying that all this is to me?
You asked the question. But you know, that place, and then you go inside and you know, he had a scale, but I don't think he ever weighed what you bought. He'd just say, that's $1, that's $2. It was a remarkable place. And that started my fascination with food. My father introduced me to the road. My father introduced me to barbecue. My father introduced me to the community of people that gather at places like barbecue joints. My fascination with food starts there.
In fact, this book started off as being a very different book, right? Do you want to talk about that?
Sure, yeah. My agent, who's wily and smart, and the agent also for Allison Miller here, David Black, sold this book as The Light from Distant Windows. And it was, you know, that idea of the road, that I'm driving, that I'm heading out. You know, and it was about my relationship to restaurants. And I referred to restaurants in the proposal as second homes. The thing I realized as I began to write that book, which became this book, is that I hadn't reckoned with why I needed a second home. Why did I leave my first home? This book became about that. And it ultimately concludes with me finding home. You know, teaching in this program, when Valerie Boyd invited me to teach in this program, I took a step toward claiming Oxford as my home and belonging here as well. If you pick up a copy of the book, is this appropriate to say? Yeah. If you pick up, let me pick up my hold on. If you pick up a copy of the book, and I hope you will, when you turn to the dedication, you'll see that it is for VBH, that's my wife, Vivian Blair Hobbs, and VJB, Valerie Jean Boyd, who showed me the way home.
That's very sweet. I'm going to let the audience ask a few questions, but I just wanted to end by asking you, what is it that you hope readers will carry with them when they read this book?
I hope that people will recognize that a life wherein you try and fail, sometimes miserably, but then try again, that you recognize that what defines you are not your failures, but your responses to them. I hope you'll also see that, you know, this place we live, the American South, is not fixed in one time. I think we too often talk about tradition. Tradition, schmission. I don't think that's even a riff. I don't think it's a good one. I think culture is a process, not a product. The South is continually evolving, just like this campus is reinvented each time freshmen step on this campus. It becomes a new place, changed by them, changed by the ideas they carry in their heads. And I think about the American South as a place that is by no means fixed in time. Not 1865, thank you Jesus, not 1965. This place continues to evolve. And I hope you see in this book a way to grapple with some of that change, a way in which I can be, to a certain extent, an interlocutor in a region swiftly changing.
Thank you, John T. I think we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Do we have a microphone somewhere?
Yes,
or
may I ask a question as you're doing that? I'm curious, how many people in this audience watch TrueSouth?
Whoa.
That's amazing. So y'all are proving the point I said to my publisher, in that, like, if y'all will send me out across the South to talk to people, the TrueSouth audience will come out and we'll have a good conversation. So thanks for proving me right. And you had a question, I'm sorry. Yes? Here, I'll handle it.
Yeah. Before you came on, I was just flipping through your book, and I came across the passage where you were introduced to REM in the Athens
Yeah.
music scene.
Yeah.
And it sounded like it kind of changed your path in life. It taught you that you could be different, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
You expound
Yeah.
upon that, please.
I mean, I don't want to overemphasize my association with REM. I was on the periphery of that world, kind of looking in. I remember waiting in line one night, I think this is in the book, when they were playing under a pseudonym, Hornets Attack Victor Mature. And, you know, I never got in the show. I just stood on the outside looking in. And I saw people who were rebelling in a different kind of way than me. Instead of drinking and dancing and being a dumbass frat boy, they found another way to rebel. And as I got older, I began to understand that art and writing and various forms of expression were their own rebellions. And I learned that from bands like REM. I learned that at a show at Legion Field. I remember going to see Jason and the Scorchers play on a double bill with REM. And Jason Ringenberger, the lead singer, was singing I Saw the Light, the old Hank Williams standard. And then halfway through, he just jumped in the air, screamed like a banshee, and fell off the stage like screaming as he went. I was like, so what he's doing is he's reinventing the country of his past, turning it into rock and roll. Like in that moment, I saw, okay, you can take your past and reshape it in the moment to make something new. And that excited me. It took me a while to figure out how to get there, but music did teach me that. Yes, sir.
This question has the possibility of seeming a little confrontational.
That's fine. I mean, if I write a book like this, I'm open to anything, man. Come on.
Yeah, and I'll try and establish a bona fide before I get to the question, which is I was born and raised in Georgia.
Yeah.
I went to UGA undergrad. Left as soon as I could, never expected to live in the South again. But things change, and I do. I wonder, given your caption above the title, A Southerner Goes Searching for Home, you have, and TrueSouth and everything else, you have to have reflected on yourself why white Southerners are so obsessed with their Southernness. Because there's culture all across this country, right? There's culture in New England and culture in the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest. Why do you think that is? Why, for example, is your book captioned A Southerner Goes Searching for Home rather than I Go Searching for Home?
I think, thank you for that question. I don't find it confrontational at all. It's a great question. I think there are two things I want to say about that. One is, Southerners have a lot to explain. I think it's Fred Hobson, I think that's the literary scholar. He called it the Southern rage to explain. Like, we come from a tragic, complicated place. And it's the work of a lifetime to try to figure out how you fit into that narrative and whether you're a part of the problem or part of the solution, or maybe a little bit of both. So the work of understanding my relationship to the South is the work of my life. And I would take exception, I won't be confrontational with you, but I would take exception to saying that that it's white Southerners who are obsessed with being Southern. There's a blurb on the back of my book from Kiese Lehman. And Kiese, when you look at his tagline on his website, he calls himself a black Southern writer. I think, no matter your complexion or your ancestry, I think if you live in this place, you're trying to figure out how you contribute to this place and how you can contribute to this place, how you can claim it. I think that's universal, and it gets to your point. Like, everybody, who claims a place assigns a certain part of their identity to that patch of soil from which they come. So I think The Rage to Explain is an attempt to reckon with enslavement and Jim Crow and its legacies. Like, full stop, that's it. But I think the engagement with that work is not defined by race.
So you have the same connection that Faulkner does at the end of Absalom, when Clinton says, I don't hate the South.
Well, that's a great point too. So if y'all couldn't hear him, he said, so you have this connection to Faulkner when Faulkner has a character say at the end of Absalom, I don't hate the South. So this is a little bit of a riff, but I've been thinking about this a lot. So the common narrative among Southerners is I love the South and I hate the South. Y'all have heard that refrain, right? And that's, I think, what it means in many ways. When we're saying that, we're saying, like, I know the South in its fullness. Some things make me mad, some things, I love. But I've come to reject that idea. I love the South and I hate the South. And in doing that, I have a difference of opinion with Patterson Hood, who wrote a great essay for The Bitter Southerner about that early in the years of The Bitter Southerner, about the duality of the Southern thing. Natasha Trethewey writes about that, and I deeply respect her and call her a friend. I don't believe in a duality. I love the South. And I believe that well-intentioned criticism is of itself an act of love. To want more for the place you live, to want more for your family, that is an act of love. So I don't buy the duality. And Faulkner begins that with, tell me about the South. You hate it there. I love it. And I think criticism, pushing towards some change is part of loving it. You got me wound up.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, if not, I'd like to thank you again, John T., for being here tonight. There are signed copies of John T.'s book available for sale outside. Did you sign them all? Or are they?
I did not sign them all. I'll say this, genuinely, thank y'all for being here. It means the world to me to come back to Athens with this book, and I look forward to talking to y'all. If you'd like your book inscribed, I would love that. My fondest hope is that some of y'all will read this book, and then get in touch with me. I mean, seriously, you worked 5 years on a book, I want you to read it, and I want you, I write everybody back. My website is johnsedge.com. If you write me, I'll write you back. Tell me what you think. Challenge me. I'm good for it. Come on. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank both of you very much. I don't know what kind of dean I'd be if I didn't mention that tonight's event, like so many of our events, was made possible by generous donors to the Grady College. And I wanted to thank them. And I wanted to remind everyone that this program is part of our low residency Master of Fine Arts program in narrative nonfiction. We have another in screenwriting as well. We urge any support that you would like to bring our way, and we urge your participation. So we're delighted that you're here tonight.